Hello everyone, and welcome to part one of two Christmas tutorials we're going to be doing. In this one we're going to be drawing just a little Christmas bauble using our pastel pencils. So I hope you enjoy this one, and let's get started. So welcome to this little tutorial, which is part one of two that I'm doing for Christmas. This one's going to be in pastel, this little Christmas bauble, and it's on the 10 by 10 centimeter white pastel matte paper. And I'll be using just Carbothello pencils for this one. But look, if you don't have the Carbothellos, you can just match the colours from the sets that you have. So I'm going to start. This is quite small, so we've got to just be realistic about the amount of detail, especially up here, just at the little gold section of the bauble. We've got to be realistic about how much detail we can get in, but this is designed to just be a fun little tutorial, so we're not going to stress too much about too many details. Now I'm going to start on the actual red bauble itself. And for that one, I'm going to use a base of the 325, which is the Carmine Red Deep. And all I'm going to do is just come in and around. Now, of course, I've already got my line art down. And for my line art, I just use a little bit of graphite paper, sort of the tracing paper that you can get. But you could always just rub the back of your line art or your reference image with some graphite pencil, and that would work exactly the same way. So we just want to come around, just careful around the edges, because we want to make sure we're keeping that nice shape of our little bauble. Now I am going to come in with the 640, which is the Caput Mortuum Violet. And I just, where I've marked that on the line art, I just want to pop that line in there so that I don't lose it, because this sort of is indicating where those darker and lighter sections are. And for the lighter one, I'm just going to come in with a 681, and again, just put a little mark there, just so we don't get lost when we're actually coming in and filling this in. So now that I've done that, I can just come back in with that 325 and just fill in our little bauble. And of course we will go over this, but we want this vibrant base layer down first. And just fill in the whole section. You don't need to press too hard. It's always better to just put, you know, a lighter layer, and then we can always come back in over the top. I do prefer to do, you know, a couple of layers as opposed to coming in too heavy-handed to start with, especially when we're beginning, because, you know, that is something that I think a lot of beginners struggle with, is putting too much pigment down too early on and filling that tooth of the paper. Now, up this side where it is a lot brighter, we're going to just ease off on the amount of pigment we put down. I still want a little bit under there, but I just want it much lighter. So you can see how I'm just very, very light there, like so. Now, what we want to do now is just push that pigment down and into that paper. And I like to use cotton buds or Q-tips, depending on where you are in the world. I think these are fantastic for blending. You can use a paper stump, or you know, you could use a sponge of some description, a makeup applicator. But I find, especially for these smaller little areas, the Q-tip or cotton bud just works perfectly. It doesn't sort of lift the pigment off. I think I find sometimes with a paper stump it moves things around too much, and a sponge will lift the pigment off, which we don't really want. Now I've just turned over because I don't want that darker pigment here. So I've just got a clean end to my Q-tip and just push that little side there. Now we want to be keeping this clean because it is the white pastel matte paper. So I just use a little puffer tool, just that you use for keyboards, just to remove that. And keep a kneadable eraser handy as well if you have one. And just, if you do feel that you're getting a little bit of pigment on your paper, get rid of it straight away. Because if you don't, then, and you happen to just accidentally lean on it, then you've got that potential that you might push that pigment into the paper. And then it will be a lot harder for you to remove. Now, saying that, I have just come in and pulled some of that pigment out. I'm just going to give that a clean up. So just a dab, you know, with a little bit of pressure, can remove that mark. Okay, now back to this section here. I'll probably come in and put another layer of that red in there, but I want to just darken down this side here first. So this is back in with that 640, that caput mortuum. And again, I'm just looking at that reference. Again, you don't have to put a lot of pressure. If this layer isn't dark enough, then we'll add a little bit more. And you can see in the reference that that dark area runs all the way around the edge of that bauble. And then down into this bottom section. A little bit more, you know, it sort of fades in here. So we don't want to bring it all the way round, sort of like the whole bottom of the bauble. Try and sort of just keep it a little bit midway, and then just ease up on your pressure and just sort of flick out a few little lines as it sort of disappears. Again, up this edge here, we've got that slightly darker edge. All right, now in here is a bit darker, but it's not nearly as dark as up here. So we do want to just be aware. Tonal values, which is the difference between your lights and your darks, are the most important thing, especially in something like this where we're trying to get a flat piece of paper to take on that, you know, that appearance of it being a round ball. So I'm just going to ease up on my pressure on that pencil. There's a little bit sort of coming out from here, so we can add a little bit of that. Just little tiny little squiggly sort of motion, just where you can see that it's just that little bit darker there. Up the top here, the same, but then it gets a lot sort of lighter as it comes down. So again, ease up on that pressure a little bit. All right, so we'll come back in with that Q-tip. Just push that pigment down again, just being careful when you get up close to that edge. We're not sort of bringing that pigment out onto the background of the paper. Now what you do want to do here is keep your edges nice and soft. You don't want this to be too harsh. So I like to just sort of dab that Q-tip just along the edge. You don't want a harsh sort of line there. You want to keep that lovely and soft. Again, just careful around your edges. If you do accidentally come over, then just, like I said, you can grab your kneadable eraser. Or if you have a Tombow mono eraser, that would also work. Again, just want to soften. Then this little one's here where you can see on the reference image where you've got sort of the lines are coming across. Blend in that direction. Push that pigment down, but go in that direction. You don't want to be doing like swirls there and then you end up losing, you know, that sort of shape within that sort of dark shaded area. Again, just a little bit more of a blend if you need it. Just going to grab that puffer tool. Now if you do use one of these puffer tools, keep it away. Don't put it straight up near your paper because you'll blow your pastel off. So you just want to be aware of that. I'm just going to clean up this edge. I am not a huge fan of the white pastel matte paper. I bought a sheet of it for one of my academy projects, and yeah, I'm not a fan. I'm a little bit messy. I'm a messy pastel artist, and the white, I must admit, does stress me out a little bit because I'm constantly worried about keeping the paper clean. So you will see me throughout this tutorial just tidying up my edges a bit throughout, just to make sure that that is nice and clean. Now again, just want to come up this edge. Now another tool, and this is in no way necessary, is a color shaper. Let me just grab my one. So this is a color shaper. It's just got a little silicone tip, and they come in like a set of 5, and they're easy enough to get on Amazon and things like that. And they all have different shapes. I like this one that's the little point, little conical sort of point, and you get all different sizes. This is the 0, and it goes up to, I think I've got a 6 set, which I don't use a lot because it's just a bit too big. But these ones are perfect for just getting into those tiny little details, maybe in eyes and things like that. And I've actually got a little sticky label on mine because I've got one for my pastels and one that I use for graphite, because you don't want to be sort of mixing them up and using your graphite one on your pastel. So if you've got one of these are great because they've got such a lovely point that it is a lot easier to sort of come in and work on some of that, you know, those more intricate sort of edges. But look, if you don't have one of these, it's not a big issue. They're reasonably inexpensive. So if you can get a hold of one, you won't be disappointed with it. You will use it. Let me just go back in with that Q-tip. I think I've probably gone a little bit too dark on that edge. That's all right. Again, just want to keep this nice and soft. I think this little bit here needs to be a bit darker. Now I've used, like I said, the graphite for putting down my line art, and I do that quite a lot. A lot of people sort of say, oh my god, you can't use graphite when you're doing pastel drawings. And no, you certainly wouldn't be wanting to put graphite down now, and you certainly wouldn't want to put it all over your drawing. But I have never ever had an issue with putting down graphite for my line arts. If you don't like the idea of using the graphite, then, you know, just put a bit of pastel down and use pastel as your base, you know, your line art instead. Now I want to come back in with that red, that 325, because I want to build this up a little bit more. So just filling in that little section, softening just around this sort of edges. A bit darker just as it comes up here. Like I said, I think I've gone just a little bit too dark on this edge, so I'm just going to run that red just round it just a little bit, just to tone that down a little bit. And then again, make sure that we're getting rid of any of that dust. And then again, just push that pigment down. You want to be getting that pastel pushed down and into the paper. I'm over the top of that little area there. Maybe a little bit more of a glaze of that, a bit mortem. Again, keep everything soft, so little sort of squiggles. And then again, just a dab, a bit of a push down into the paper. Okay, I'm going to use a little bit of the 311, which is the carmine red middle. And I'm just going to put a bit of that just over the top of some of this red. Not so much on this side because it is a little bit darker, but down just underneath here, we can see it's a bit lighter. And again, as we come down towards the end of that little bubble, we can see those lines sort of coming through. So sort of just drag your strokes through that bottom little section there a bit. I'm then going to come in with the 681, which is the light flesh tint. I'm just going to add a bit of that up the side here. Comes over a little bit just underneath there. Again, look at your reference. Maybe a little bit lighter just on this side here. Again, very light pressure. I'm going to come over that line a little bit with this as well. Again, just to tone that down a little bit. And again, we can just come in with that Q-tip. Give that a little soften. And when you're blending as well, again, you don't need to be pushing overly hard either. You don't need to be really hard. Keep it nice and light. I'm going to come back in through this center little shaded area with the 325, that carmine red deep. And I'm going to add just a few little dots through it, just to break it up a little bit. As you can see in the reference, that it's a bit sort of, I think, dappled, if that's the word. You can see the little dots, and we can even add a few of that lighter red, the 311, the carmine middle. And same thing, just tiny little squiggles through it. You're just skimming the surface of the paper. We just want to sort of lighten that overall tone, because like I said, it's not nearly as dark as over here. I think this little edge here could be lighter still, so we can just come back in with a little bit more of that 681. Add a little bit more in there. Again, you can just even just sort of tap it rather than sort of blending back and forth. Give it a little tap. Again, I'm just going to give that edge just a little clean up. Now this section here does need to be a bit darker, so I'm going to come in with the black. This is the 750. We want to be quite light in our pressure here. We don't want to be turning it too black. We still want to be getting that red tone. So just very, very gently, I just hold, you can see how far back I'm holding that pencil. And I'm using it on its side. I'm not sort of coming in hard like a pencil. So just on its side, and just glaze that black. Darker here. Like I said, go light, because you can, it's harder to take away than it is to apply some more. Around here is quite dark. Even just in here, just as it curls round the very top edge. And the bottom here is the same, needs to be a bit darker. You can just come in with that black. Again, just glazing over the top. And same thing just as it comes round the ball, just sort of pull that strokes round. We're trying to sort of mimic that roundness in the bauble. Tonal values are so important in our drawings, and regardless of the medium you use. I always say this, in any tutorial I do, that, colour really is, a bit irrelevant, really. We could do this bauble in any colour we wanted. We could do it in, blue, green, it could be multicoloured. But it's the shift from those lights and those darks that'll give you more of that realism than you will get just basing it off of colour. So that is really important. Just going to add a little bit there. And then again, we can come back in with our Q-tip. Again, just give that a little soften. Again, don't blend too much. We want to maintain that sections of darkness. If you, like I said, come in here and just blend, you're going to end up that everything is now, a muted sort of, just a darker red. And you're not going to get that shift that you're looking for. So little dabs. Just little swirls with your Q-tip. Or your paper stump, whatever blender you're choosing. Just sort of push that down into the paper. Get as close up to that edge as you can. And like I said, pull those strokes out. A little bit darker again just up here. Another little glaze of that black. If you feel it's going a little bit too dark, come in with another little bit of that red in certain sections. You can always sort of adjust as you go. Keep this sort of edge nice and soft. Same here. Little sort of swirls just round the line where it comes through. We want our little transitions to be, to be subtle. Now, another thing I love to do, and I do this all the time, if you've got a bit of pigment on your Q-tip, so I've got the black on here, and I want to just ever so slightly darken a section, I'll just come in with that Q-tip and I'll just sort of tap it where I want it to be a little bit darker. Like up here, I could have it a bit darker. So rather than coming in with your pencil, don't waste the pigment that you've actually got on that Q-tip. You can lighten up your pressure a little bit. Use it a little bit like your pencil. And it's a great way of just getting those little details that are lovely and soft and subtle. Clean up that edge again a little bit. I will tidy all that up in a minute. All right. Put this little sort of lighter sort of line here. There are a few sort of little, this is the 681, sorry guys. And just sort of lightening this up a bit. I'm just sort of tapping the pencil again, just very lightly, just on some of those sections where it's, you know, at its brightest. We've got a little, just underneath the top here of the bauble, there's a lighter little band there. I'm going to draw that in with that one, and then above that is the red. I might just come in and just, I need to sharpen this pencil, getting a little bit too blunt. I just use my craft knife and then give it a little sand on some sandpaper, and it gives you a nice point. And then that way we can be just a little bit more precise. I'm going to bring that red just back under there. Right. Again, gonna have a bit of a look here. Probably a little bit more of that red just coming up and into that darker section, and just little sort of swirls. Sort of just dabs. A bit more here perhaps. Again, just breaking up this bottom edge. Again, using that Q-tip with that bit of black on it, I'm just going to sort of bring out a few little lines, few just sort of little dots, just where we can see it's got that little bit of a shift in that tone. Same up here, we've got a little sort of shaded sort of area. We'll just soften this edge, a little bit harsh. Run that Q-tip along there and soften that. Just going to get that wee up with that puffer tool. Still think this top edge could be darker. Back in with that black. And, you know, don't be scared of your darks. Your darks are, you know, just one of those things that is going to make your artwork pop. Again, don't bring it all the way down. Just look at where it's the darkest. Get a little bit. Same down here. You need that contrast. It's so important. Otherwise your drawings can just look a bit flat. darker just to here as well. Again, don't pull that darkness too far. I'm going to use that lighter red, that carmine middle, 311. I'm just going to brighten up. And again, when I'm applying my strokes here, I'm trying to sort of get that shape. You know, coming in with some of these strokes. And just sort of mimicking the shape of that ball. Now another thing you can do too is you can take a clean finger, make sure it's got no oils and everything on it, and you can just tap. And that'll just push any pigment down. And the fingers, you know, probably a bit better than the cotton bud. You don't get that, you know, that shift the same, especially when you just do this tapping. It's amazing how it just, you know, yes, it'll pick up a little bit of pigment, but certainly not, you know, to the level that your, you know, your sponges and your Q-tips and that will either. I'm just back in with that colour shaper just to soften and push in that little bit of red that I popped in there. And I'll sort of fix this up a little bit once we get into that top little section there. Alright, I'm going to, I think it needs to be just a tad lighter. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to glaze. Now for those of you that haven't you know, followed one of my tutorials before, if you're glazing, I'll just get a little bit of putty rubber to show you. When you're glazing, there should be no movement in that putty rubber. You don't want to be digging into it. As soon as you do that, you're pressing too hard. What you want to be doing, it's just a very light back and forth. And you can practice that by doing that and then going on to a spare piece of paper, come back, and you know, you'll over time you'll get to know what pressure that is. But just tiny little back and forths. And you can do this whenever you want, just that slight colour shift in any drawing you're doing. So again, you don't want to be using the point of the pencil, use the side. I'm just going to be careful here because I am getting close to that wood casing. Again, hold your pencil far back so your pressure's light, and then you can just sort of glaze. And this is a fantastic way to just alter, especially if you're limited on your color palette. You know, if you haven't got the pencils, I'm just shifting a little bit here now just to get a bit of that tone down the bottom there. But it's a fantastic way, like I said, if you're a bit limited on your pencils, you can lay down a colour and then just come across, you know, with a bit of a glaze of another colour, you know, so that you can actually get the result that you're after. So if you do sort of, you know, follow along with any of my tutorials and I mention glazing, that's what I mean. I think a little bit of that red needs to just come into this darker area here as well. I might even need to go back to that 325 here. It's very subtle, but you can sort of just see it sort of coming through darker little section. Then I might go back to that caput mortuum, that's 640, and we've just got a few. So again, very light pressure. This is a glaze. Just on this little section here, you can see just a few of those sort of little streaks that are slightly darker. And then I might come in with a little bit of white. So this is just the 100, the titanium white. And I'm just going to dab that, little dots, very, very gentle. Just on some of these lighter little sections we can see. Now again, this is a great thing to do as well, whether it be with your white or your dark or your black, for example, is you can do a wee glaze of the white. So I've got the red there. If I just do a wee glaze very, very gently over the top and just bring in my Q-tip and just give that a little soften, it will automatically lighten up the tone of where you've glazed that white. And the same applies to the black. Now I might hold off on doing too much with the white until we've got the top of this bauble in, as well as the grey sort of shadow down the bottom. Use a little bit of that 681. This little section at this side of that little white line needs to be a little bit lighter. Again, just a glaze. A little bit more of that 311. Just lighten up in here just a little bit. A few more little dabs here just to break up that little sort of darker section in the middle. And same here, just sort of break up that edge a little bit. Now if you are pooling your lighter colours or your darker colours into your light, either or, always just wipe off the tip of your pencil, because as soon as you go into that darker section and you come back out with that pencil, you're going to bring some of that darker pigment out with you. So I always just either have a microfiber cloth or even just a wipe on your fingers. It's just enough just to get that black off the tip, so that you're not dragging that back in and over your drawing, because that is the #1 reason that a lot of us get those muddy sort of colours. I'm going to just pick up a little bit of this darker pigment. You can always darken this back down again if we need to. And I just want to reinforce in here just some of that darks just coming up into the bauble. Not too bad. Okay, now before I move on to this, I want to tidy up. I'll still might revisit this, like I said, once we've got that greys in. But what I want to do is I'm going to grab my Tombow mono eraser, and I just want to neaten up this edge. Again, especially with the white paper, we want to be maintaining, you know, that white. We don't want any of that red being pushed down. Okay, I'll just grab my Tombow eraser. So, if you're not familiar, this is a Tombow mono eraser. And you basically just get the little refills, and the little erasers just go into these. And I use this a lot, especially in my graphite drawings. Not so much in my pastels, because I don't usually need to, unless I'm using white paper. But there's also another little thing I discovered. This is Faber-Castell's, and it's just like a little pencil eraser. And it's got, the one I bought's got a little sort of brush on the end, which can be handy for the graphite, but not for my pastels. But this is really good too, because you've got that precision as well. But I'll show you the Tombow mono eraser first. So I always sort of usually cut a little chiseled edge into mine so that you've got a nice little point on the top there. And then you can just come along that edge. Now, what is very important is that if you pick up a bit of that colour, you must get rid of it, because as soon as you put that down again onto the paper, all you're going to do is just transfer, some of that pigment. So these are good, and like I said, it's not something I would normally use. I'm going to try the Faber-Castell again. I never think this is ideal with pastels. Like I said, usually it isn't necessary. Get rid of those little erasings. I'll just grab my kneadable eraser again, because to be perfectly honest, it's probably the best for this sort of situation. So if you haven't got one of these, at a push you could use a wee bit of blue tack, but these are really cheap from any sort of office supply store. And you just, like I said, you just sort of dig it into a bit of a shape that you want, a bit of a point, and then just come up and around. Just try and get that edge as nice and crisp as you can. Don't stress too much about down the bottom here, because we've still got to put a bit of that grey. Sorry for obscuring the camera there. I'm just doing exactly the same as I did on the other side. It's just that I don't want to sort of move my drawing while I'm filming. Alright, so that's not too bad. Again, I always want to just give that a little, probably lost the shape a little bit here. See if I can fix that up. Same with, as soon as you've got pigment on here, bend it over, give it another squeeze, get a clean bit, because the same sort of thing, you're just going to end up pulling that colour into an area that you don't want it to go. I think what's drawing my eye there is this dark section here. I've got that too much of a line. Let me just grab, I'm going to come back in with that 325, the Carmine Deep, and I'm just going to pull that over that line a little bit, and I'm just going to soften that line, little dab. Going over that line a little bit. Like I said, I'm a bit of a messy pastel artist. Still got that little bit of a bulge there that's just irritating me. Let's see if I can get that with that eraser. Better. Make sure there's none of that pigment on if you're if you need to do this with yours. But I wasn't going to use that brush, but I might use it just to flick away some of that, those little erasings. Again, I think it's because this little line here is a bit harsh. But don't be afraid to sort of come in and make some adjustments. You know, add a lighter sort of colour. Bring that more up to the edge there. That's so harsh. That's a little bit better. Little dab, just so that that pigment's not sort of sitting on the surface there. All right, I'm going to move on to this little section here. And for that, like I said, please do not think that you're going to get tons of detail in this. Unless you want to do your bauble bigger, you've got to be realistic as to what you can achieve. Now I'm going to use a little bit of the 724. It's a cold grey 4. And I'm going to just get that in round the edge here. Make sure you've got a reasonably sharp pencil. Like I said, we haven't got a lot of room to move here. Bring that round like so. And then I'm going to use the 692, which is the golden ochre light. Now we want to be careful coming up to that red. I'm just going to come in and block in that whole section. Again, careful with the red. Get a little first layer down in there. I'm going to come in and put a bit of it in the top here as well. I'm just going to run a bit of it just over that grey. We do have a slightly darker section just where this little pin is coming out. I'll draw that one in. And then I'm going to use the 615, the dark ochre. Let me just push this pigment down first. Again, very gentle. Might just add a little bit more of that. Just brighten that up a little bit. Again, a little press down. Alright, so in with the 615, the dark ochre. I'm just going to go through some of these little lines. Again, just pay attention to your reference. They do sort of come around in that direction because we're just at the angle of that little bubble. Darker sort of little section at the top. But like I said, we're not going to get all of that intricate detail into that top section. I'm going to come in and just do those little darker little marks that are just on the side. And this is just with that 615 again. Come in with a bit of the 610, that raw umber. And I'm going to sharpen this though, because it is important that we keep reasonably sharp points here. Sharpen. Just get a bit of a sharper point on there. Just going to add some of that just over the top of that grey. Just little dabs. When you're working in a small little section, it's sometimes easier just to sort of tap it as you go. Rather than trying to do one solid sort of line. Again, put in the little center here. Darker ones just on the edge. Some of these, just the tips of them are a little bit darker. Whatever you do, don't fall into the trap, and I'm pretty guilty of it, to be honest, is don't fall into the trap of zooming in, especially if you're viewing anything on your tablet or things like that, because you'll get frustrated because you're trying, like I said, to get in the detail that, isn't there, that you can't possibly get, on a little drawing of this size. I'm just coming back in with that 692 because I want to get these little sort of shapes at the bottom of the little sort of, I don't know what you would call it, the lid or whatever it's called, the little top section. Now, this is important. This is important to have that piece of kitchen roll or your microfiber cloth, whatever it may be. I think I've just smudged that, haven't I? Be careful as well not to lean over the top and smudge. Use a piece. I've got glassine right here, and I'm not even using it. But yeah, get a piece of glassine paper or even just a piece of, printer paper at a stretch. I mean, with something this size, we probably shouldn't be leaning over the top of it anyway. And like I said, this white paper just stresses me out. It really does. Because I'm just constantly, I think it gets to the stage that you actually see things that aren't even there. And you just want to clean it up. Okay, so back to what I was saying. I'm paranoid now, so I'm just going to move my glassine over a little bit. We want to be putting in these little dots at the bottom, but we don't, because we're going to be touching the red, we don't want that to go onto this, because otherwise it will bring the red up into our actual drawing. So we'll come in and we'll just put a little mark, wipe your pencil. fiber cloth a bit closer. And then on this next one, wipe off your pencil. And then just make sure that they're actually joining into that section. Again, if you think you've picked up a little bit of that red pigment, just wipe it on your microfiber cloth. Now that I've got this little section in here, I can see that that little highlight needs to be a lot brighter. So I'm going to come back in with my white, make sure the tip's clean. Just lighten that a little bit. And I'll probably lighten up that more as we go. Now again, I'm going to just give this white just a little sharpen. Might just do that in my sandpaper. Now if you do sharpen on your sandpaper, you just sort of rub it back and forth, just make sure that you wipe your pencil on a piece of kitchen roll or something, because if you pick up too much dust on here, as soon as you put it down on your paper, you're going to get the dust. And all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to pick where those lighter reflections are in here. Now, like I said, I can't stress enough, you are not going to get all of this detail on this size. Again, I'm just coming in between some of these, adding a little bit of that white. Not on all of them, only on the ones that I can see are a bit brighter. It gives us that little bit of a contrast. Down the side needs to be a wee bit darker. So I might come back in with that 610, the raw umber. And just on that very edge. Nice sharp pencil for this. These need to be darker on this side. Again, you're not going to get those little sort of V shapes that we're seeing in there. A couple of these little ones at the end have got the darker little mark, so we can always just put a little dab. Again, there's some just sort of sticking out a bit more at the side. Down this little edge here a little bit more. A little bit more just along the edge here. Lighter in here. We can always add a bit more of that 692 as well. You put down a bit of the white and you think it's just a bit too bright, this little one here needs to be longer. It does sort of come down and in, but it is darker at the base. So we might just add a little bit of that 610 That raw umber. Round off the back here. You can see there's just some little, it's like little dots. Just going to add a few just to give a little indication of that sort of structure. Too much on this side. Needs to be a lot brighter in here. I'm going to dab a bit of that white. This little edge here needs to be a lot brighter. A little bit more of that yellow. I don't think we're going to get away with much more, to be honest. To a little white section just in there. I'm going to grab my generals. I like using these quite a lot. This is the Generals Pastel Chalk Pencil, 4414, but you can also use just a charcoal pencil. And this just happens to be Generals, but any white charcoal pencil would work as well. And these are fantastic just for getting that really bright highlights. I use it a lot. You know, maybe for that little highlight in an eye or something like that. If you haven't got this, don't worry. Just come back in with your white. But you can just see how it does sort of give that real brightness to it. Now I think I've sort of lost my way a little bit with the shape here. So I'm just going back in with that 692, that golden ochre. Just going to extend that out a little bit. I think here too I've gone a little bit off. Needed to be a bit straighter. And hopefully you haven't on your one. And then all we do then is just sort of bring that brown just out a little bit more. In here. Again, got a bit of that white just in here. Right, is it? Or is it just me? Just that little bit. Again, this is just the 610. Right with the inside a little bit with that 692. Come into black, but I'm going to be very, very, very careful. I'm just going to dab that black. We swap back to the 610 for this front section. I think this little pointy bit could be darker. Back in with that 692. I'm not happy with the shape of that top. That's a bit better. And this is a great thing about using pastels, is that you're able to make these little adjustments. I'm going to bring just a little bit of that 610. We can see in this sort of one here, it's just a bit darker. It's got that little bit of colour. And then I'm just going to run it back up those little edges. Again, if we need to, can reinforce these. And you might need to. You might not need to do this because you've already, done it right. Again, I think these could be a little bit brighter. So I'm just going to come back in with that 692. What I'm doing here is I'm getting it more on the point and I'm giving it a little twist. Because sometimes you'll find that that'll just deposit a little bit more pigment. Again, wipe off that pencil if it touches that red. Put the black there. I think I'll go back to that 610 again. Put that little edge. So I can have a bit of a look. Lighter little areas in here. So for that, I'm just going to come in with that generals and just do a few little dabs. Like I said, I'm very aware that we can't get the detail. All we can really do is just, have a bit of a play with our colours. A bit of white just there as it comes round. Again, we can brighten up this little section here. We might come back in with our red. I'll use the 325, sorry guys. I just want to pool a bit more of that red. Just up and under. You can see that it's just got a bit of a lighter sort of tone. A little bit of that white by doing that, but that's okay. We can just come back in and just reinforce that little bit. All right. I'm going to come in with my black, and just on this side, I am going to just add a tiny little dot just on these first ones that are a wee bit darker. Again, we can always just darken this little section here, maybe a little bit. Like I said again, don't be afraid of your darks. You really want to be getting that contrast. Just going to darken that little section down there a little bit more. Use my Q-tip just to pull it across to the edge. It's not as dark all the way. This little section here is quite dark. A bit more as well, perhaps. And just soften that edge. Yeah, shocker, I've just gone over that edge again. Come in with that black and just see if I can neaten that up. It'll soften. Little sort of squiggly little lines. And then maybe just the tiniest bit of black just coming up on those little lines in between. Make them stand out a little bit better. Just a little bit darker, perhaps. All right, I might leave that section there for now. I really don't think I'm going to get much more detail in there. I think I've lost the shape just ever so slightly. Get my carpet Morton probably. That's 640. Just on this one on mine, I've just kind of lost that shape a little bit. I'm just going to add a little dab. I think that's going to really make much difference, to be honest, but it's annoying me ever so slightly. And then again, I might just pop that little dots back in there. All right. I really don't think I am going to get any more detail in there without really sort of botching it up, which we don't want to do. All right. So next we want to get this little bit of snow in. So obviously we're working on a white paper. So we want to try and get the appearance of this shadow. What I'm going to do first of all though, is I'm just going to lift and tap with my kneadable eraser over the top of some of this transfer line. Just dabbing it, and that just lifts the graphite off. So if you ever feel that you've just put a little, you'll be very hard to see that on camera now, but I can see it here. If you ever feel that you've just put down a little bit too much graphite, you know, you've been a bit heavy-handed in your transfer lines, for example, then just come over it with a kneadable eraser and you can tidy. You know, you can lift some of that graphite as long as you can still see it. I just tend to make mine a little bit darker sometimes so that, you know, people can see it on the actual camera. So in here, we've got, it comes down a little bit here. You can see the white. So I'm just coming in. This is the 724. And I'm just going to be very, very light to my pressure. And I'm going to dab. I'm not really, you know, I'm trying to mimic that texture. So I'm kind of just dabbing it bringing it sort of up and out. It's darker obviously in here, so we can put a little bit more pressure when it's closer to the actual bubble. Again, be careful with that red so we're not dragging that out. If you need to, just, you know, give that a wee wipe. And then it comes down, probably just about there. Now under this side as well, again, we want that broken sort of dabby sort of thing happening. Over this side, there's not so much of the dark, so we can just, you know, maybe a few little blobs here and there. And under here. Look at your reference, kind of sort of gauge that shape. If you want to use like a reference just to see how far to bring your darker sort of shadow up, have a look at your reference and you can see on this darker shadow here, this top edge is sort of almost in line. So I probably wouldn't want to go much higher than that. And I also probably want to, as it comes away from there, I want to lighten that up a little bit as well. So reasonably dark in here, again, just keeping that little dabby sort of motion. And then I'm going to, a little bit maybe just in here. And then there is a lighter section there. And then I'm going to swap over to the 722, which is a cold grey 2, which is a bit lighter. And again, really, really soft pressure here. Again, I'm just doing that little dab, using the sort of side of the pencil more so that I don't make things too harsh. We can bring a bit of that in here. We still want to see that white sort of coming through. There are a few little dabs of that lighter one. I think will look quite nice. We can bring some of the lighter one just down here, maybe a little bit more, just to indicate that snow. In here. Again, might change back over to that 724. See if we can darken down some of these little areas. Again, still want to be doing that dabby motion. We don't want, we don't want it to be one solid sort of mass. Might also come in with a little bit of the black. Now we're going to be very careful here. There's just a few little sections just underneath. Again, we can just tap, use the side of the pencil and just little taps. You can always sort of darken down that bottom of that bauble a little bit more if we want, just a little glaze. Because now that we've got a bit of that snow in place, that'll sort of help us a little bit with our tonal value. Try and bring that black out a little bit more, just on the edge of that bubble. I'm going to grab my Q-tip I am just going to dab. I'm not blending here, I'm dabbing. Just sort of toning that black out a little bit. A little bit more of that lighter grey. Again, very light pressure. We just want to sort of mimic where that snow is sort of disappearing. Feel we need to just, add maybe just a couple of darker ones here and there. You can always just come back in. Now, if we want this to be a bit lighter, if we feel we've just made things a wee bit too dark, just come back in with your white. Trying to find my fellow white. There we go. What we can do again, just make sure the tip of the pencil hasn't been sort of infected with any of that white. What we can do is just add some white here and there. Again, same sort of thing, just little dashes. You can clean off your pencil. That just sort of splits up some of this darker area. And look, you might not need to bother doing this. If you're happy with the darker sort of snow, then, leave it as is. I'm just sort of demonstrating that you can just come back, and even if you're using white paper, there's no reason not to, just add a few dabs just here and there over the top. Again, like I said, that just sort of brightens the colour underneath. It'll brighten up that greys that you've used. Again, it's fading out over here. If I step back, I think this here is probably a wee bit too harsh a line. Again, you can just add a few little dabs just with that lighter pencil and with that white or your lighter grey. You can always use, if you've got the generals, you can always come in and use that. But I think the Carbothello pencil is probably quite sufficient. We don't need to overdo it. I might come back and just darken this little section maybe a little bit. Yeah, we don't need to overdo it. This is, just so that we can get the idea that it is actually on some snow. Break up these with the white. Maybe just a little bit too clumped together. So have a bit of a play around with it. Add some darks. If you don't like it, you can come across. Another thing you can do, if you feel that you've gone too dark, take your kneadable eraser, make sure you've got a clean edge, and just tap it. You just tap it, don't rub, but just a tap will just lift a bit of that pigment off. And it'll lighten it up a little bit. You can always just as well just sort of make it fade out. You can just sort of drag your kneadable eraser just at the edge. I'll use my other hand. Don't know how well I'll do here. But yeah, just sort of if you pull that out, it softens that edge just where it's sort of disappearing. And that just sort of softens it. But yeah, these kneadable erasers are fantastic. Again, you can just, you know, put it into a little more of a little point if you wanted to, and just sort of dab it just so it lifts up just a little bit. So, like I said, have a play around with it, have a bit of a practice. Like I said, this one we weren't going for, because it's small, you know, we weren't going for that sort of real, you know, realism look to it. Yeah, and this sort of time frame, you know, it's just a bit of fun. Lets you see that you can create, you know, something that's, you know, reasonably realistic in a very short period of time. You know, this is the sort of thing you could just, yeah, in an afternoon, just polish off. And you know what? Something like this would be fantastic. If you wanted to make a wee Christmas card out of it, you know, just take a photo of your finished artwork, and yeah, you could turn it into a Christmas card. I think that would look quite nice. Like I said, you could spend, you know, quite a amount of time. It's completely up to you how much time you want to spend on your drawings. What I'm going to try and do with this white, I don't know how lucky I'm going to be, but I'm going to try and just run my generals on the paper and just see if I can just crisp up that edge a little bit. Be careful if you do decide to do this, because like I said, if you pick up a bit of pigment, then you're going to end up with red, like a red halo. And make sure that pencil's clean. Like so. Alright, well, I hope you've enjoyed this little tutorial for Christmas. Next week I'm going to be doing a graphite one. So hopefully you'll manage to join me for that one as well. I'm just going to add my initials to this one. Probably just down here somewhere, just in between the snow. Like so. Alright guys, if you want to share your finished drawings of this little bauble, just head on over to the free Facebook group and share your images there. I'd love to see them, and I hope I can catch you all next week. Alright, bye for now.